I thought I was going to be a research scientist when I was in high school. I'm part of the Sputnik, when Russia, excuse me. But then I took a class on American government, and then in the 1960s, all these issues started popping up, civil rights, many others. I got interested in that. Okay, if you put it there, I can get to it. So I looked for a way to combine political science and science, and it turned out that's what I emphasized in graduate school, and my PhD dissertation was on that subject, these two worlds, one highly rational and one not so rational. And so I got a PhD from the University of Wisconsin and got a nice job offer from Duke University. So I joined the Duke faculty and thought that was going to be my career. But I think the second year of teaching, I thought, you know, if I'm going to teach this stuff, it's probably useful to have worked in the government and see how it is from the inside and see whether the things you're pontificating about as a faculty member really match. So I got a fellowship for a year, expecting to go back to Duke. And the fellowship put me in the office of Senator Joe Montoya of New Mexico. And I replaced Tony Anaya. He had been a legislative assistant, and he went back to work on Anaya's campaign, on the senator's campaign, Montoya's. And so, after being there for like a month, he went back on the campaign, and Montoya called me and said, "I'd like you to be a permanent legislative assistant." And I thought, well, I'm going back to Duke, but it would be better for me to be not a fellow, but an actual legislative assistant that could do things. And so that's the path I took and said yes. Well, by the end of that first year, excuse me, I was having so much fun, I wrote a letter to Duke and said, "I'm not coming back. This is too much fun." We were doing the Clean Air Act at that time. And that is still one of the strongest environmental pieces of legislation that we've ever had in the country. It doesn't cover everything, but it did a lot. And even more than that, Montoya said to me, "Look, I'm up for re-election. I don't have time for Muskie's debating society where you work." Montoya was an old horse trading kind of politician. I'll do this for you, and you do that for me. And he was very successful doing it for a number of years. So it's not a knock on that, but he just didn't have the patience, and he was distracted by his own campaign. So he said, "You go to all of the hearings and all of the closed committee meetings and take notes, and then talk to me or send me a memo, and I'll write it. I'll tell you how to write my proxy letter." Back then, much more than now, a senator could just sign a letter saying, on this issue, like auto emission standards and what the Congress was going to enact, and you can write it, sign it, and it counted as a vote in committee.
Wow.
So I was writing these letters as a junior faculty member, 28 years old, and saying, "This is fun." That's one of the reasons I didn't go back to Duke. So I stayed with Montoya for a couple of years. Then I went to work for Senator Moss of Utah. He had much more of his staff money put into legislation, and so I had a bigger shop to work with. And was working on a variety of issues. And then I got an interesting thing. Let me divert a little bit into the Muskie Debating Society markups were some of the best legislative process I've ever watched. And it wasn't just him, it was other members of the committee. It was Republicans and Democrats, and so I want to spend a little bit of time on that. Because one of Muskie's best friends that no one knew was Howard Baker. Howard Baker was a Republican, and he was, in fact, eventually the majority leader in the Senate when Reagan was in. And so it was fascinating to sit there, watch things go by. And these were the olden days when the markup sessions, you have a hearing where it's public, it can go be broadcast and everywhere. Then when that's all done, the staff of the committee starts to draft legislation, or they may have already had a draft that the hearing was on, and then you would take tentative votes in committee. The thing that was so valuable back then, and I'm not arguing for closed sessions, but back then, they could ask any dumb question and it didn't embarrass them in the public. And you got a chance to educate members by that happening. And that, frankly, is missing these days. Much more posturing where I'll take a position and stick with it without working it up in the process of, well, I could get more votes for this, or maybe it's not going to pass unless I make these changes. And you keep getting more information. As a result, the staff, like for example on clean air, the staff of the members of the subcommittee got to go to Detroit and be briefed on what they were doing on auto emissions technology. And so it was a great time to be working with members who really cared about legislating, and the chance to make adjustments as you go. So the Clean Air Act was a lot of fun to be working on, but it's basically, there's a book out from a friend of mine that says, this isn't the right title, but it's Back When the Senate Worked. And he was one of the staffs working on it. He ended up as a staff director. So we came out of committee on the Clean Air Act with very strong support and no amendment on the floor thrown by senators who didn't agree with the bill. None of them passed. So the bill went over to the House, and there's another story there. I wasn't on the staff, but we had lots of staff sessions between the two. Now, why could we do that, and why could senators spend that much time? One of the things that is really difficult these days is campaign financing. Back then, the year that Muskie was up for re-election, he spent the last 3 months of the summer campaigning, and that was it. Now, 6 years later, when you're going to be running, you start raising money. And that's not something we can get rid of, because the Supreme Court decided that money was speech. And you couldn't limit the money because that would be limiting speech. We have a number of things in our Constitution that are really getting in the way of us being able to work together, and I don't know that they'll ever really change. But the Clean Air Act was clearly a bipartisan event. But think back to 1970. 1970, Muskie had gone on national television giving the speech that the Democrats wanted, and as a result, he was viewed as a very likely presidential candidate in 1970, because in '68 he had run as Humphrey's vice presidential partner, and they almost pulled off the upset of Nixon. So there you are in 1970, and Nixon is worried about fighting with Muskie on an issue that had a lot of broad public interest and support. So Nixon's staff, on the other hand, hated the environmental groups. They did not want, they wanted Nixon to veto the bill. And lots of people think that happened. It didn't. He signed the bill because of the fear of running against Muskie. When the Clean Water Act came to be in 1972, and I'll talk a little bit about the process for that, but it's very much like the Clean Air Act process. The advice to Nixon on the Clean Water Act was to veto it, because Muskie had not become the candidate. He was running against McGovern, who, while a very decent person, McGovern just didn't have the votes. He only carried one state in opposing Nixon. So Nixon felt like he could veto the Clean Water Act. Any of you know what that happened to that bill?
No.
They overrode his veto unanimously.
Yay!
Wow.
They just stuffed it down his throat, and so that was a very interesting thing to watch and to be part of. But the point being, back then the situation was such that the Senate was actually working, and the House as well. So what was going on that would allow that? Well, a lot of the things I mentioned about closed markup, lots of public involvement on the subject, a lot of press. But fundamentally under it all, most of the members on our committee were friends. Howard Baker, for instance, was a very good photographer, and we would have him hang in our committee room his photographs that he. And they used to have lunch together. That almost doesn't happen at all these days. If a Democrat is sitting down with a Republican, there's going to be another Republican to think that he's a turncoat and shouldn't be meeting with them. And that's pretty common to have that kind of barrier in the process. We began at the end of the 70s. Well, let me explain further. Since I had resigned from Duke, the next step for me was to stay working for Ted Moss of Utah. And then one day the Muskie staff came to me and said, we'd like you to join our subcommittee. And I had been working with them, and so that caught me way off guard, thinking, this is a dream job. I'm going to take that and stay here as long as I can. But it was really an era when members talked to each other, worked with each other. There have been times of that in the past when it happens and when it doesn't happen. We're now in a situation where it hardly ever happens, and I can't see how it's going to turn around for quite a while. They've already divided up into camps, and lots of friction between them. So what happened was much more of an emphasis by members on raising money to run because it was getting expensive. Media was coming in. The internet wasn't even there as an issue, and it is now. But in the 1980s, what happened in the election of 1980 was that the Senate surprised everyone and flipped over to the first time Republican control in decades. And so that changed the process. And we were seeing, for me the difference was, are you in the Senate because you want to make good policy for the country, or you want to be in the Senate to be in charge? Just flat out, just be in charge. And we got a lot more members coming in that were that way. And changes happened that are still playing out. When I look back at the committee membership of the Senate Environment Committee, which had a different name then, it was Public Works and Environment, half of the Republicans on the committee were New England Republicans. And they were very willing to work with Democrats. And the same was true on the Democratic side. And so the fact that these senators from both parties that would get along with each other were changed out, and like Montoya lost his seat to Harrison Schmitt, an astronaut. And I remember watching him. I would walk on the Senate floor as staff had access to do, and I'd look over and Harrison would be just sitting there by himself. He wasn't talking to anybody. He was happy, but he wasn't doing what politicians normally do, which is, if I got some spare time, I'll go talk to this guy about this amendment he's got, and I'll go. And so you had a change out that went over a number of years. And the ultimate change now is the kind of really harsh partisan division that's occurring now. And we saw it starting in the influence of the Tea Party folks. Social media started to come up. So it was I should finish the rest of my career, piece it together here. So in 1980, I had become the staff director of the Environment Subcommittee and had 7 people who worked on those issues with me. But we had worked up the Superfund bill in the late 70s, and it passed in 1980. I was still happy in the Senate, and then something happened, and that was that Muskie became Secretary of State. And I was either going with him or likely to have a senator in charge of the subcommittee that I didn't want to work with. I knew him for taking money under the table. I knew a number of other things like that, and I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So I was going to the State Department with Muskie because that was the only path I could see would work out. And then a guy named Don Karl came back to the Senate, asked to see me. Somebody in New Mexico had told him this. And so I sat down in the Senate cafeteria in the mid-morning with Don Karl, and he talked with me about what he was doing and my background. And at the end of that, he offered me a job. So it was one quick interview, and his big reason was he wanted to have the lab understand Washington, D.C. and how it was changing better than the people that had been coming up in the lab to do government relations. They hadn't really ever worked in Washington and hadn't worked in the Congress at all. So in that sense, I felt very lucky. And so we packed up, and in September 1st, 1980, I became an employee at Los Alamos and was Don Karl's chief of staff, and also ran his government relations office. So here I am in 1984, walking down the halls of the Dirksen Senate Office building, and a senator named John Chafee from Rhode Island was walking the other way, and he just stopped. He looked at me and he said, "Karl, how long have you been gone?" And I said, 4 years. And he said, "We haven't done anything since then." He was very frustrated because he was a New England Republican, willing to work on environmental legislation and other things, but finding that the gears were kind of coming off in the Congress because of the splits that had come through. But probably the most significant thing that started to accelerate the turnaround was Newt Gingrich. Newt got elected from Georgia, and he walked in and he looked around and he watched the way the leadership was going. And the Republican leaders in the House were led by a guy named Bob Michaels. And he was a very nice, decent guy. His approach was, we're in the minority, I'll try to get some things that our side would like, but he didn't want to have any big bloody battles. Gingrich was only interested in bloody battles. He's written about it, he's talked about it, and he basically said, we'll never get control in the House unless we change completely our approach. And that meant it wasn't good enough to say, well, I got some good things done in this bill on this subject. Did that help you take over? No. So he focused much more on scandal and disruptive behavior. And for quite a while he built and took over, in fact, the House. And then, this is when, if you get really cocky, that's when you're really looking for trouble. Because if you can't, you won't remember it probably, but remember Clinton and Gingrich clashed on the debt ceiling issue. And so Newt Gingrich thought, I've got it, we can strike now, we'll shut down the government. And so they did. It backfired, and it damaged him, and his own party began looking at kind of the overreach that he had made. They had been rising up, they took over, he thought it would keep going, it didn't. But the damage had been done. There was a lot of underlying tension, because you had very different kinds of members now that were running for office and getting in. Then a couple of guys that I knew pretty well in Washington, D.C., named Norm Ornstein and Tom Mann, wrote a book because they'd been watching the growing dysfunction of the Congress, both the House and Senate. And the title of the book is It's Even Worse Than It Looks. And then 4 years later, they wrote a second book, which was titled It's Even Worse Than It Was. And they simply documented the things that were getting stopped in terms of legislation that would improve an area, whether it was healthcare, whether it was environment. You marched through the issues, and more they were being handled by what would get us totally in charge of issues. Just a word about them. They were two academics who had done what I did. I got the fellowship to get me to Washington. Well, they had congressional fellowships, came to Washington, but they then left and went to think tanks in Washington and wrote these books. They went into the Congress 9 months before I came from Duke. They're retired like I am, and so they haven't written the third book, but it's even worse than it was before. I mean, right now, it's hard to see. And now let me contrast it with climate change. Here is the biggest, toughest issue that we've had for a long time, maybe even looking back at the Civil War. And this huge, tough issue where corporations that don't want to make the changes are flooding campaigns with money and really distorting the debate that's going on in the Congress on these subjects. And you then lose it, makes it more difficult to get the public to go along with you, because if I buy an electric vehicle, that's a good thing to do, but just appealing to the public to do that and solve the problem won't solve it. We have to we have to do much, much more to get movement. And you worry, one of the things that is a phrase sometimes used in the Congress is, you got a tough issue, you're trying to move it, somebody asks you what it looks like and how it might move, and they basically say, we don't have enough dead bodies yet. That's a cynical thing, that the staff will do when they're fed up with the fact that they can't get something moving. So here we are with a system that, since my time in 1970, I think the process in Congress and even with the White House may have had a little blip on a piece of legislation on healthcare by Obama, but that's very important, but it's not solving a lot of the problem. So you've got this big, huge issue, and having great difficulty figuring out how you're going to get it together. I've been tracking climate change for 50 years, since the 1970s. In the early 1970s, a lobbyist for the Friends of the Earth that he had testified in front of us and a lot of other things. He knocked on my door one day and all excited, and I said, Rafe, what you got going? Sit down and tell me about this. And so he described a study that they had done on climate change and global warming. Wow. And he at this time, we had a bill moving through, and I looked at him and I said, Rafe, if I try to put a provision into this bill, we haven't had hearings. Most of the members would run from it because they could see how tough it would be to enact. We've got a lot of work to do ahead. I can't put that in this bill, even if, I still don't know if I agree with you because this is the first time I've had a big review of it. So we've got an issue that when I first looked at it, I thought it was almost impossible to deal with. We know now there are things that we can do, but we're not doing them. And it's hard to see how we're going to get really significant action. So that leads to questions of what kinds of control, what kinds of things need to develop in order to set the stage for successful activity in the Congress on this issue. And obviously, depending on who wins the nomination in both parties this year and then the next steps beyond, what candidates will be arguing for strong legislation. So I think one of the things I was going to talk about a little bit was what's happened, and I will only barely touch this, what's happened to the Los Alamos National Laboratory over this whole period. Lots of institutions in America have been hurt by the fact that we got so many unresolved issues, partly by the way that our government system has gotten more and more dysfunctional. What's the population of the laboratory now?
17,000.
This is listed as over 14,000.
Oh.
What do you think it was when I started here in 1980?
7,000.
About 7,000. But if you go to the 14,000, you got to add over 300 guards and 3,000 contractors. So the lab has not, suffered like you might have thought. So sometimes we don't feel it the same way as so many other parts of society do when we have issues that are unresolved. So what's underlying some of this? I'm going to make one more key point, then I want to throw it open to questions. there's a political scientist at Wisconsin, a woman who grew up in rural Wisconsin and is now on the faculty of the University of Wisconsin. And when Wisconsin moved a few years ago from a very experimental, known for progressivism, and all of a sudden here comes a new guy, becomes governor, rips into everything. So she wanted to know, how did this happen in my state? I'm a political scientist, I better find out. So she went out, and she was from the rural area, so she had good access, and she interviewed lots of people. And she wrote a book. And the book is called The Politics of Resentment. And as soon as I read that, it resonated with me a lot, because we've got that in New Mexico. The rural areas feel like the cities are just beating up on them. Getting the resources, we don't have a hospital within 100 miles, and now you've got a bunch of them, and everything is going to the cities. It's an overstatement, but it's real. And so figuring out how to change that so that this kind of deep resentment that's that the cities are taking all of the money. Well, you go to most cities and they all feel like they're still strapped. You know, crime, you name it, issues are difficult. So I have to be careful of, it can be a negative message, because even if you can crank up the public involvement more, getting the successes that we need in the political structure are going to be long and hard. I'm not optimistic as to how long and how far it will go. But let me stop at this stage and just throw it open to questions. You know now at least what my background is, and the fact that I've kept working at the Congress from a number of different vantage points. New Mexico, one last quick comment. New Mexico is kind of lucky that we don't have what Wisconsin has turned into. And Wisconsin's trying to climb back, and there are states all over the United States that are in this same situation. Let me stop and see if you have questions that you'd like me to try to deal with or explain or discuss. Yes?
We didn't talk about Sandia. You left Los Alamos and then you went to Sandia.
Well, I skipped a step. I was happily working at Los Alamos, and I called from a friend of mine who was on the board overseeing the Muskie School of Public Service in Portland, Maine. One of the things that Muskie had when he retired was to put his name on this public policy school in Maine. And it was probably the strongest, smartest, shrewdest staffer I dealt with. His name was Leon Billings. He's now dead. And he said, "Karl, we got a job for you." And I said, "Leon, I have a job." And he said, "No, we need you to come and build out the Muskie School of Public Service. You owe him." And I said, "Yes, I do." He gave me some experiences that were fantastic. And so I said, "Explain what it would take." And I flew out for an interview, and they offered me the job, and I thought, well, I can either stay here and continue having a good time at Los Alamos, but I do owe it Ed Muskie, and it's a chance to do something very different. So I did that for 4 years, because what the Muskie School needed is they had grown and were renting 7 different places in downtown Portland, and they needed to combine together. And I said, "Well, you've had a dean for a few years with this goal," and I said, shouldn't we just let him do it? And he said, no, he doesn't have a chance of getting what we need. And I said, well, how's he raising the money? And he said, well, that's a problem, because they're using Muskie's old campaign finance lists. Those die the second you're out of office. And so this guy might have been good, I dealt with him later, but so I said yes. And so for 4 years we lived in Portland, Maine, which is a nice city. And I used to be able to recruit faculty because they all need an ocean. We need mountains. And so my wife looked at me and said, are we going to die in Maine? And I said, well, maybe we should think differently about this. Because I like mountains too. I grew up in southern Utah and lots of years in New Mexico. So I did that for 4 years. There were some simple things to fix. One is I had a very popular president of the university. They had not been using him to help raise any money. As soon as we did that, things started to change, and we hired a professional fundraiser and that sort of thing. So we're cruising along and getting ready to wrap up the campaign. And I thought then, if we're going to go back, then now is probably the best time, because I was a faculty member, so I'm going to say something about faculty members. How did I put it? They knew how to do some things and not others. And I had to ignore some of the things that they wanted to do in redoing the curriculum and stuff like that, which faculty are always wanted to do. And I didn't really look forward to the battles I was going to have with the faculty. So I called a friend of mine who had worked at Los Alamos with me, Paul Robinson. And I said, Paul, my wife and I are both Westerners. I work closely with you. You have a lot of contacts in the West. If you hear of a job, let me know what you think. And he said, you get on a plane and come on back and have dinner with me and Al Romig, and we'll talk. And so we had the dinner, and they offered me a job running their government relations shop. And I thought, this is pure luck. So I did that for 10 years. Again, it was a very successful lab. And then it was just time to retire. I was getting older, and there were a few other things to try to do. So anyway, people sometimes ask me, well, how do you compare the two labs? And the nice thing about a government relations job is that there are a dozen committees in Congress that want to hear what are going on at these labs.
Yeah.
At least. And I can list them off. On armed services, you've got 2 subcommittees as well as armed services. That's 3 right there. Then add 3 more from the Senate side, you're up to 6. And you can just I haven't touched a whole lot of other issues. I've only dealt with armed services. So, in this discussion. So, I mostly say, look, these are 2 really excellent laboratories, and compared to other institutions, they're vital in many respects. But there's a difference that you can see and feel. And Sandia is an engineering lab. Los Alamos is a science lab. And now you can look at it and say, but Los Alamos hired a lot of engineers over the last 20 years. And Sandia hired a number of physicists and scientists. But I can still see the difference, and here's one quick story that says why. I was at Los Alamos, and knock on the door, and the scientist came in that knew me, and he was all excited, and he said, "We've proven it works." So I said, "Okay, sit down. Tell me what works." He had had a very interesting, different experiment to test out his theory, and it had worked. It was a proof of principle item and had no more chance of becoming real for years than anything else. But he had done his role, and what needed to happen with his work is it gets handed off to a team of people who have all the other skills to do program development and scope out science, knowing what kind the next experiment should be, and would that ever have a path to a real product that gets worked on. So I didn't want to change him at all. He was very good at that kind of work. Now, there are plenty of people at Sandia, at Los Alamos, who do have things that become a product. But they have to be partnered with people who have the engineering skills to figure out the things that you needed to know. So I said I was going to stop, so I better stop. And questions? Yes?
First, a comment. This building is running on solar right now, and has been for the last 3 months. Having said that, we also got a horrendous gas bill in January and February this year. Money talks to a lot of us, and that was one of the things that got us to thinking about we got to get off gas too. My question had to do with the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes?
That got some assembly of 30 or 50 Republicans to vote for it. I don't know the thing. Do you have any insights on how they got some sort of a
Yes.
Across the aisle?
The smart ones that might normally reject it saw a lot of money on the table in this, and they could picture the discussion later. Why didn't we in our state or this district go after some of that money? There are some that voted against it and are now being attacked in their district because of that vote. Because now I think it's not that the money will all be handed out by who voted which way, but if you're in line for, you have a need that makes sense and an opportunity that makes sense, then you can often just take credit for it, even if you didn't vote for it. And then it'll be up to your opponent in a campaign to use that against you. And so, unfortunately, we'll see what lessons some of them learned. But I saw that happen on public works bills. In the Clean Water Act, one of the things that we did was provide 75% funding for municipal waste treatment plants. The whole country was behind. And so this was one where you could push that kind of issue. And I saw members who had voted against that kind of thing turn around just because they saw they would want to get one of those, even if they were attacking the Democrats for being spendthrifts. Other questions? Back in the back and then up here.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you could list, I don't know, 2 or 3 topics you believe should be brought up in this next election, which may just be a rematch of what we've already done, to look at so people would see what might be important for the health of this earth. If not, I mean, there's a million topics, but maybe you got maybe 3. What do you say?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Let's see if I encapsulate it. What are some of the things that can be done now? I think there's already a pretty good list, the Inflation Reduction Act, it was really a surprise to me that it could get through as big as it was. And so I think this state is mounting an effort to participate, and that's an area that ought to be strong here. We've, in fact, I like there's a co-op, Kit Carson Co-op that supplies towels. Watch them.
Yeah.
There was a conference last week that I was at, and no, that wasn't that conference. It was a talk that he had. He was asked what they really want to do, because they have been shifting their utility away from coal and any kind of, hydrocarbon-based system. And some are finding that, and they're about there. They have all renewable energy now. And someone said, well, what have you got next? He said, to sell it around the West.
Yeah.
In other words, if they can do that, they can even lower the rates for their customers. So that's the kind of thing that needs to, but let's see, I don't, say what's more in your question?
Two is fine. Saying, we're pretty active in Los Alamos.
Yeah.
Getting people aware of what the issues are in the election. And, Los Alamos is pretty small, but we have a high percentage of people who vote.
Yes.
So, as you know, and so I'm just thinking, well, if you were just going to choose 3 or 2, whatever, number of things to talk about, if these are important issues, what would you choose?
Okay, yeah. Because my background's environmental and I'm on the board of the Sierra Club, I would lead you towards many of those. I'm one that says, from the beginning, when I thought I was going to be a research scientist, to on to being a political scientist, follow the science. And
Okay, you better give your wife's favorite thing though.
what?
That's my #1 issue,
You told us.
immigration.
Immigration. No, it's good in a couple to have different things. But I went with her down to El Paso. There's a team in Albuquerque of, what have you got, 100 people?
100 volunteers.
Volunteers. And there's a guy in El Paso named Ruben Garcia who has for years been dealing with migrants and immigration issues. And he called to his contacts up here in New Mexico and said, we need more people to help deal with the flood of migrants. And here's what happens. They get across the Rio Grande somehow. If they have papers, then these social service volunteer organizations in El Paso try to get them tickets from a sponsor somewhere in the United States. And I should have you be explaining this.
Okay, no, I just was making a point, I can explain immigration.
So finally, ICE puts them on a bus, makes sure they have the paperwork, and they come up here to Albuquerque and stay in a hotel that the city pays for, and then they have language speakers and others who start calling the sponsors with them and finally lining up a plane ticket and then getting them to the airport, and that's the last these volunteers will see of them. They don't keep, long-time contacts. So it's a very humanitarian thing, and there's a whole lot of folks that have come across the border, but it's too big a flood now, and I don't know how they're going to deal with it, because there's only so many volunteers that you can have unpaid doing this kind of work. Do you have another comment?
No, it's just I could just put that on your wish list for the government to fix.
Oh, yeah. Yes, okay, I should take off my little teeny environmental hat and put on a bigger one that covers more issues, because there are a lot of other issues.
So,
Yes.
well, just to complete Jane's thought and yours, the comment I heard on the news this morning, probably the rest of you heard it, was in New York, I guess it's Eric Adams was saying, we have these immigrants, they're dying to work, we need their work, but they can't get working papers. And I guess, is it true that the president was going to try to change that rule?
He did for them.
And let them, how did it work?
It's a federal decision to give people work permits. So it
Louder?
has to come from-
Right away.
It has to come from the executive branch.
Okay.
There was something in the news about the president giving that capability to get green cards and working permits to thousands
Immediately,
of
yeah.
Venezuelans who
Yeah.
have come here before July, I think it
Yeah.
was.
I mean, it's just a win-win.
Yeah,
Um,
yes.
We need
Well,
it, they need it.
I hope to be proven wrong, but one of my comments about immigration is, if you have a solution, you don't understand the problem. Because every solution just has been running aground things, and so you have the governors that you see on TV that are just feeding off this to strengthen their base of support. Immigration has always been a very sticky, tough issue. What has it been, 30 years since we've had a significant reform of the statute? Other questions? Yes?
So you mentioned Kit Carson Electric, and one of the great things that they're talking about is using green hydrogen, producing green hydrogen.
Green hydrogen? Yes.
Yeah, and they said recently that they had applied, so there's this hydrogen hub. And
Yes.
when our governor tried to pass bills for producing blue hydrogen, they were killed in the legislature, and she ignored that, and she's now joined a coalition for the hydrogen hub, which doesn't specify whether it's green or blue or gray. And I've forgotten the name of the head of the Kit Carson Electric, but he said he had applied for money from the hydrogen hub or to participate, and they had not responded. So what is it with this hydrogen hub that's being crammed down our throats?
Oh, okay. There are three kinds of hydrogen. One is pure green, that is you use the electricity for electrolysis to break up the hydrogen atom into water, and that's good. The environmental groups all support that. The second one is called blue hydrogen, and that's where they take natural gas as an input, and that's not so good. It's better than the brown hydrogen, which is just totally done off fossil fuels, and somehow redoing that's supposed to make everything fine. So that's going to be an issue of the battle, because yeah, I haven't talked about the governor. I've had a fair amount of experience with her, because began briefing her when she was a member of Congress, and that was a number of years. All I can say is, in this state, it's very hard to go toe-to-toe, full bore with the oil and gas industry. It's just hard, and I think one of the things the environmental groups, and I'm not leading this effort, but I'm usually on the team calls that go back and forth. Gonna have to really work what happens there, because there's really no sense in building a hydrogen initiative on blue. But we'll see what happens with the rest of the lab has some play in this game as well. So, let's see, yes, and then, yeah, go ahead.
Interrupt you just one second. Lots of us want to stay here for a while and listen to you, and some people need to leave at 1. And
Yes.
so I'm just gonna tell you, if people need to leave at 1, you know what I told you, leave all the stuff there, it's fine, and I'll clean it up. But they may leave because they have another obligation, but some of us are gonna stay, if that's okay with you.
Sure,
Okay, so I didn't want you to think people just didn't care.
please, go ahead.
Besides hydrogen, can you tell us about some of the other issues that you're working on for the Sierra Club?
Yes, we have a wildlife coordinator who is just fantastic. And she has fought, we used to, for many years, we were trying to ban the use of these leg traps that your dog gets caught in them, because they succeeded finally. Now, after, I don't know, 6 or 7 tries to get the legislation through. So they're now trying to expand and look at wildlife corridors where the roads are cutting off the pathways. And I can't tell you as much about, because she's so good, she doesn't need any help from me. She's leading a coalition of many other environmental groups working on wildlife issues. And if you've seen some of the recent stories, we are really losing wildlife fast. And to that, you got to count insects, because they're part of the whole ecosystem. So that's one. Let's see, what are some other? For reasons we don't know, the governor vetoed the tax credit on environmental vehicles. And we'd like to find out how to get a bill that she would support. Because in this state, in this one, the governor's veto has not been overridden in years. So we're a state that's got a powerful governor role, and we'll try to see what she's doing there. And we think that climate change has taken up so much of the issue. Another one that we're working on is the longer-term plan for P&M. They're moving much slower than the statute required to replace the coal-fired power plants with renewable energy. And so I think we have to keep pushing that. We're trying to get building codes adjusted. Buildings do a lot of impact on climate change. And that means changing building codes. And as soon as you do that, you get attacked for the fact that you're going to come in and rip out everybody's gas-fired stove, which of course is not what would happen. But it's easy to caricature what things would do to individuals in your home. So that's just some, but I should have brought with me the newsletter that has about 15 different topics, and I'm trying to think out loud now about. But there are lots of issues, and there's pretty broad coalitions in the environmental community now that work together on each of these issues. I mean, yes.
So I think it's very interesting to hear what's dysfunctional about the population, not just the government, as the politics of resentment.
Yes.
I mean, I hadn't heard that title put on it.
Right.
But my question is, since it's so pervasive, what can change that? Does it just take a charismatic leader, or does it take people recognizing that money, that no taxes is going to solve it? Have you any insights into what could change?
I think all these issues require constant attention, because they'll slip away if you don't treat it that way. So I'm not sure how to respond. You're looking at how to reach the public and get them more agitated. Well, one of the things that I've watched a lot, the media is story after story now on what global climate change has done in floods, in earthquakes, and everything else. And I've wondered myself, when will people really wake up? And it's not so easy. You have to keep pounding away. But I keep a stack of articles just coming in the media that deal with climate change, and there's an awful lot there. So then I think you're probably right that it's going to take somebody who, Biden's going to have trouble adding the charisma to that topic, but he's very good on it and on the right path. We have so many battles ahead on climate issue that we just have to find every opportunity to bring it up and raise it and try to get the support. One of the concerns now is, what's the public debt of the United States? Do you know what it is? $36 trillion. So no wonder some members are saying, hey, we got to stop spending. On the other hand, if you do that, things will crash.
Yeah.
So it's more delicate. I think, did I see some? Yes, check. You'd have a better idea than I do about the climate. So go ahead.
Does it matter what individuals do? I mean, induction stoves, heat pumps, does that matter, or is that just small potatoes?
I think it matters because politicians, whether out of fear or commitment, have to pay attention somewhat. It's very easy to get cynical. I mean, I began, once Rafe came in and said, Karl, you're missing the big issue. And I said, it doesn't belong in Superfund, it's an environmental issue. I've been wondering, when are we really going to get going on climate change? And there are fits and starts here and there, but it's really a tough issue. But it's going to be even tougher on our grandkids and great-grandkids. And that's one of the plays that some of us use in talking to. What kind of legacy do you want to leave?
The reason I asked that question is, it's my observation that there are a lot of people who think climate change is a problem and they put down everybody who doesn't. But they don't do anything about them. If you ask them, what about a heat pump or an induction stove, they don't even know what those words are.
Right.
And so, for instance, if I asked everybody around here, although this is probably a select group, how many people get better than 40 miles to the gallon in their cars? How many people have induction stoves? Yeah, I think you would find that while they're nice people, they aren't doing anything.
Well,
so that's what I'm wondering.
Jane's going to give you the Braithwaite answer.
Our eldest son is an environmental chemist, and we were discussing this. I mean, this has been his career, and I said, Scott says, little things really matter, and he said, no, Mom. He said, not really. I mean, it's good we're all trying. He said, but you already blew it, Mom. I said, what do you mean? He said, you had too many kids. We have 4. And I said, it's the oldest child, you can say that, can't you? So I don't know. Yeah, it's hard. I can't get rid of my kids, sorry.
May I make a comment about that? Because I think a lot of what happens these days is an effort to make individuals feel like it's up to them to do something. And I think a lot of the people in this room probably recycle and, do the kind of things that Chick said. But I really think if government and business don't take on the responsibility, because they're the ones that are generating more plastic, they're the ones that are generating more waste. And, you know, you shouldn't have to feel guilty that you had that third or fourth child. You know, and I think that a lot of people feel like as much as I'm not doing enough. But it's not, no matter what all of us in this room do.
Well, that's why I asked
It's
him
a
the
drop in
question.
the bucket though, compared to what has to happen, like by the big corporations and by government, and not just in the United States, but all the lot of places. And I think that this is a terrible problem with climate change, because, you know,
Oh, it is, it's
it's
huge.
affecting the wildlife, it affects everything.
Yes.
And yet people spend all their time on this, a lot of trivia.
But I think you have to still keep throwing the issue back at the people who will make the decisions, and those are the elected officials.
Like, why do you think so many people are trying to immigrate? Why do you think they're
Yes.
leaving the land where they were born, and where their culture and their traditions are? It's not because they want to walk across the Darien Gap.
Yeah.
It's because they have a horrible life where they live. And it could be because of drought, or
Yes.
floods, or all sorts of things.
Yep, very good.
But that's why I asked him the question, because to me, what it says is the following. You have people who make solar panels. Well, if not enough people buy them, that's not gonna work. You have people who make electric cars. So all these industries are only gonna succeed if you do something. And you can, it's really easy to sit back and say, well, it's the politicians, if they don't do anything, there's nothing to be done. I guess I'm a romantic or something, but I think people investing in all these businesses is a really good thing to do.
Well, government can put solar panels over all their parking lots, so my car doesn't get to 120 degrees sitting out there in the sun.
I think it also, you know, and I agree with you, because I'm probably one of these guilty people. I have a little induction thing on my gas stove. Why? Because I don't have 220 wiring when they put in the stove. So it's hard to undo, you know, everything right now, because I wasn't thinking about this in 1991 when we bought this house, in general. But I think that the government and even local people could say, all new housing must be all electric and not gas, for example. They could, you know, put solar panels on things. I asked why they didn't do it on the schools. They were not nice when they answered. But I said, but we're building these new schools, why wouldn't we put solar panels on them?
Yeah,
Just for example.
I told them, you teach kids things, the kids are really smart. They don't listen to what you say, they look at what you do or don't do.
And I think the kids are young people.
I have another question here.
What's your view of the hope that I hear occasionally in the media of our youth? Are they woke enough? Are they active enough? Is Greta Thunberg going to bring our youth up right so that they can provide a solution to all of the problems we've been talking about?
Well, I'll take a specific Sierra Club approach on this. We have been working with this group called Yucca that's on the campuses. It's a youth group movement. And the issue we're having now is they aren't joining the coalitions of the rest of us because we're not strong enough. You know, and I scratch my head on this one because we need them in the game. But it's a game that they see is stacked against them, and they want a bigger breakthrough and bigger moves. And I can't blame them, but that's when you get to the reality of politics. And we won't go as fast as I'd like to, but we will go slower if we don't keep pushing. So that's an inadequate response. But
No, that you think that that is widespread enough for it to have an effect come, 5-10 years in the future.
yeah.
Sure.
How long do you want to keep going? I can stand here.
Well, you know, if you need to leave.
Okay.
Felicia, is there,
Nope, that's fine.
So I'm gonna just say, that I don't want you to feel like people just don't wanna hear you, but they have other
They need to-
obligations, so
yeah.
if they want to read, fine, and.
Okay, I got a hand here, yes.
Have you had interns or people that you've trained to do what you have been doing, especially when you switch to another job? Are there people left there that can continue what you've done? But
Yes, I'm trying to see how to shape that in terms of, here's an example. Let's see. Natural Resources Defense Council is a long-time environmental group. In fact, they testified at our 1970 hearings on the Clean Air Act, a couple of young attorneys. They're a long, stable organization funded out of New York and everywhere else. They have a really sharp guy named Noah Long, and he's been one of the key people in the New Mexico Coalition to push for legislation. He was one of a dozen key people for this the environmental law that we got passed in 2019, which closed down the San Juan generating station. Well, he just moved to another job, and so one of the questions is going to be, how do they fill his shoes? Because it almost, I keep saying, he can't leave. He's very good at it. So the Sierra Club has a number of college intern positions, so we can keep training the pipeline. But we have a pretty good collection of age groups that we're working on, although every one of the long-time stable environmental organizations is facing the same problem. You know what it is? Age. Yeah. Some of you have gray hair, some of us don't have any. So, yeah. Back there and then up here.
Could you repeat the name of the organization? Was it Yucca Group?
YUCCA,
Okay,
all caps,
all right.
youth, something.
Thanks. And then I would also say, I believe it was on a NOVA program where Bill Gates, who's very involved
Yes.
in such things, he was mentioning that, well, everything individuals can do, if we really need to solve a problem, we need to look at concrete, use of concrete, etc. And that would be more of a governmental, large industry approach to helping with climate change. Because even the production of electric cars, if you really trace it back, how green really is it? But it gives you the feeling that you're doing something. But if you keep using your old car and keep it out of landfill, are you doing more than if you were to transition to electric? See, I don't know the answer to that question.
And you have both.
Yeah. But it's a very complicated problem.
Nancy, you had your hand up.
Well, I have 2 points. One is I want to thank you for what you did on the Clean Air Act back in 1970.
Yeah.
And that we have Class A areas and no significant deterioration. And Los Alamos, Class 1 area, excuse me. And because of Bandelier being a Class 1 area, no power plants could be located to pollute our air. And you were very significant. I want people to know how much we appreciate that.
Yeah.
I'm going to say more on this because, so picture me, 28 years old, dealing with the mail that comes from New Mexico so I can tell the senator how I think he should vote on the act. How many environmental newsletters were there in 1970 in New Mexico?
Yeah.
There was one that I read, and that was the Bartlett's. There weren't any other ones. Occasionally a reporter would write a story about something, But in terms of working the issue, and there was nothing else for me to read from New Mexico except your newsletter.
Now we have another challenge, it's local. I was at the council meeting Tuesday night, and there was a report about a transportation study that's going to be made available in October. The lab is trying to deal with the number of cars from the increased employees at the lab, and one of the proposals is 32 buses that would bring people from all over here. I don't know what the emissions of buses are right now, or what the impact is going to be on parking lots to be found for people to, it's going to be a very interesting change in the habits of this community. So I just want to bring that up. I asked the person who was in Boston, who was making the presentation about the transfer between auto emissions that we now have from cars backed up on the hill, and also in White Rock, sometimes from the intersection of Route 4 all the way back to the shopping, the commercial area and beyond. And those cars, I mean, it takes 20 minutes sometimes, maybe longer, half an hour if you're way back. If you start out at 5 o'clock, you're back there. And all of the gasoline emissions, I don't know if anybody's looking at it. There was no item in the study to look at the air emissions that the lab had hired. I don't know the details, but the league is usually on top of all of this. So I just, air pollution, it's not, it's not polluting our air because things are going up, because we have very clean air. I don't know what the impact will be. But when we have these buses coming up and going back, and then they're in their shuttles, etc., is that going to be an improvement in the number of emissions? One of the answers was the research that the lab is doing on hydrogen. Barbara's left, but an opportunity for the lab to increase controls of vehicles. I don't know, I just throw it out as something for you to worry about.
In terms of solutions for labs, Sandia has a different solution. It's not a complete solution to the growth. They're seeing the same kind of growth that Los Alamos has. What do you think their answer is? They have 2,000 people at the California site now.
California, you mean in the state? Remote.
No, this is in Livermore, California. A branch of the Sandia National Lab exists. It was 1,000 people when I was working there 7 years ago. And now it's at least 2,000. They've got flat land, they've got expansion areas, so it's much easier. And I'm watching that to see, is there any counterpart that people here think about? The options are not easy. If there was I want to tie a couple of things together. It's something you can look at my age. I'm 81 years old. Climate change is not going to get resolved during my lifetime. So what do? I think you have to keep pressing the system. You have to keep showing the growth of interest. Sooner or later, if you get big enough, and sadly enough dead bodies, then things will break. If I look at the Clean Air Act, one of the things that both Clean Air and Clean Water, there was a river, the Cuyahoga River, that had enough methane coming up that it burned. Stories like that helped us in 1970. They probably have a different twist now, but it still takes that kind of grassroots involvement. And that means, yes, I'll write letters to members, and I'll go to a BLM hearing on land use issues with oil and gas. But I'm not expecting to solve the issue while I'm still alive. But it doesn't mean you don't keep fighting, because you gotta have that trend line, and you don't know when it's gonna break. Yes?
I noticed a couple of little headlines on my news feed this morning when I turned on my phone, and one of them said that the insurance for houses is no longer going to be able to be given due to the fact that so many natural disasters are hitting us at such proportions. So that will get people's attention. If they can't get their house insured against flooding or fire or land landslides, hurricanes, what have you. And the other one was that FEMA is running out of funding for impacted communities. That will certainly get people's attention. So that's just comments. But the other thing I wanted to say is that I guess it will take masses hopping onto the bandwagon, as you mentioned, about electric cars and induction stoves, just giving two examples. But right now, it's cost prohibitive for, the Tesla is out of our price range. I don't know about most people in this room, but it's a pretty big ticket item. And the other issue that happened to us was, I know there are places you can get induction stoves, but a couple of places that we frequented a year or so ago practically hadn't even heard of them, nor did they have any in stock, nor had they had any plans on getting them. One of them was Best Buy. Maybe that's not the best place to go for an induction stove, but.
That's where we got ours.
Well, when we asked, they certainly didn't have one in stock, and they weren't too enthusiastic about helping us. So I just thought I'd say that, and I don't know what it would take to bring down the costs of those two items for most people to be able to afford them easily.
Yeah, we have supply chain issues on many of those things too.
Yeah.
May I extend upon my wife's comments there on Mr. Headington? There's kind of two ways to skin a cat. I keep hearing this. One is to make gas $10 a gallon, or the same as everybody else in the world, like Europe, something like that. And all of a sudden, the cost-benefit ratio. We think more in terms of money and a free market society than we do as a democratic society, I believe. Just an interesting comment, maybe. But I think that's one thing that can be done is to, and for the lab, for example, to charge $10 a day for somebody to park a big honking single passenger car, the lab or whatever, out in the farthest parking lot. Things like that. And I have a vision about electric buses that work in two ways. They work on batteries, and they work between towns or going up the hill on a catenary, like electric buses did in Boston back, 100 years ago. So that they both charge as they're going up the hill or between towns, and then can move around. I'd like to see some proposal like that, and why it is, how possible is that? It seems to me like that'd be pretty possible.
There'll be an opportunity to comment when she said, the report will come out in October sometime.
Yeah.
So we should all
Yeah.
put our 2 cents in.
Good.
Hopefully that will be listened to.
Well, I still keep fighting. It may seem too easy to be pessimistic, but we have to keep writing, we have to keep talking to members, we keep doing good studies. If you think you're frustrated, look at the scientific community's reaction right now. They're so fed up with what's going on in Washington. They've been documenting for decades now the steady growth of the problem of climate change. And the political system seems mostly deaf on the issue. And so all I can say is you don't give up. You still gotta keep the pressure on, and maybe some small victories now that will build towards better ones in the future. And a lot of it's timing. The building trades organizations in the state don't like the Sierra Club for pushing for building code improvements that would help deal with climate change. So what? You know, keep pushing, keep urging that there are building codes. There's something you can grab there and tighten, and we've gotten a little tightening. We need more.
Doesn't that make money for them though?
No, they're afraid. Yes, it could,
Yeah.
but they're afraid they're just going to lose jobs.
Yeah.
That people will not, Yes.
What's your perspective on the Holtec high-level waste repository project?
Very simple. New Mexico has done its part with WIP. Don't do any more nuclear waste in New Mexico. It just, that's my initial response. Sandia actually had a proposal. I checked with one of my friends there. It was called deep borehole injection. And this guy at Sandia looked at what happens if you go way below the Earth's mantle and you put everything there. I thought it was pretty neat. It was something that would at least put it far away.
That sounds like akin to sending it into the sun.
Yeah, maybe so. No, I don't. Nuclear power is going to be an interesting issue. A lot of environmental groups still don't like it. I look at it and say, these small modular reactors are really a different kind of source, and there may just be some applications that make some sense. It's not up to me. I'm not carrying their issue because they killed that project anyway.
Is there any other solution for the government's promise to deal with the high-level waste?
Not that I know of. Okay, have you had a saturation point?
Yeah, thank you very much.